Somewhere within Japan is a small, secluded house, located somewhere within the outskirts of a city. Behind the walls of this house may possibly be a story that needs to be told, and one man is now putting his own life at great risk when confronting the potential horrors that await within this house. Japan is now in a state of panic. Its people are overwhelmed with fear, and it's because of the courageous acts of a survivor, a young woman who has joined this man on a campaign against evil. They are fully determined to shed light upon a horror that has spreaded throughout the country and force the culprits from the shadows. People want answers, and because of this man, they are going to get answers. When Hamaoka was greeted by a young man after knocking on the door to this house, "Yuma Aziri," he presumed. Hamaoka immediately noticed the foul stench within the house, the smell of something rancid. Introducing himself as a reporter for Akimoto Daily News. Basically, he just wanted to ask a few questions over the tragic incidents in Japan, where people were found melted or horribly disfigured. Briefly explain how it's believed that these dissolving incidents are not a pathogen outbreak, as many believed, but are genuine murders, and why Hamaoka is strongly convinced that these murders are connected to Yumaziri and his little sister Chizumi, and the reasons why Hamaoka is convinced that there is a connection, and the reasons behind his unexpected visit is because of a young woman who survived one of the horrible incidents. A tragedy at a high school 5 months ago, where a large number of students and teachers were found with their brains dissolved. And even though the girl's brain was badly damaged, unable to walk nor speak, she was able to say a few words, just enough to have people suspect that there is a connection between the dissolving incidents and the Aziris. And even though the girl is in no condition to leave the hospital, confined to a wheelchair, it's admirable how she was determined to join Hamaoka. Her friends, her loved ones, a lot of people have died because of the dissolving incidents. And there was nothing more she wanted than to see the culprits be brought to justice. At first, Yuma was confused, dumbfounded, but Hamaoka immediately noticed how the young man was nervous, especially when noticing the girl who was with Hamaoka, how she would sit there in her wheelchair, shaking with hatred and fear. It was obvious that Yuma was acting as if he didn't know her. But I guess Yuma began realizing the gig was up. There was no point in playing dumb. He must have known that it was only a matter of time before somebody would catch up, which is why he finally admitted. The girl does look familiar. If he's not mistaken, her name is Keiko Araisu, an old friend who was very kind to him. Oh yes, Yuma remembers her all right. But what Yuma was more interested in was how the reporter and Keiko were able to find him. And when Yuma began stepping closer to Keiko, that was when the girl panicked and screamed, stricken with fear, especially when Yuma began apologizing for startling her. And that was when Chizumi would enter the scene, finding the tearful reunion hilarious. Of all the foolish girls who were dumb enough to fall for Yuma's lies, honestly, Chizumi was more surprised that Keiko was still alive, that she didn't end up like the others, melted and having her brains just waiting to be devoured. I wonder what makes her so special. According to a few people who claim that the Aziris are involved with the dissolving murders, Hamaoka heard about Chizumi, supposedly a demonic child who torments the victims with her pranks before her brother gets involved. And as expected, Hamaoka wasn't surprised when seeing Chizumi and Yuma throw themselves into a sibling rivalry. Hamaoka did find it interesting when noticing Chizumi's odd behavior, not the malicious child he imagined. It was like behind that sinister smile was either sadness or suffering. Oh yes, Hamaoka definitely knew that these two are connected with the dissolving incidents. Except, there was something a bit off with their behavior. There was something much more than meets the eye. And when the dispute between the siblings escalated with Yuma throwing himself on his knees, apologizing for his sister's vile lies and accusations, that was when Keiko had once again went into a panic frenzy, screaming as she began fearing for her own life when hearing the desperate apologies from Yuma. And even though Hamaoka tried stopping Yuma from this pitiful act, but finding his demands falling on deaf ears, he noticed how Yuma was strictly focusing his apologies onto Keiko. And that was when Hamaoka immediately grabbed Keiko and spared her from the torment when taking her away from Yuma and the house. It was only a matter of time before people would start looking for a pair of siblings. How long did Yuma and Chizumi think that they were going to last? All those people who have died and suffered because of their appetite for evil, before somebody would come knocking on their door. Better question, how did that reporter find them? You see, Yuma was very careful in covering his tracks, destroying the evidence and relocating to another city, thus making it impossible to track him down. He wasn't supposed to be found. And when watching the reporter rush Keiko from the house, that was when Yuma and Chizumi acted quickly by destroying the evidence, pouring the bottled remains of his victims down the sink, and escape into the woods. This was not supposed to happen. Obviously, Yuma didn't plan for this, leaving the boy with no choice but to destroy the final piece of evidence by burying the heads of his parents. And after quickly digging a hole with a kitchen knife, overhearing his parents scolding their pathetic son for burying them in some hole in the cold dirt out in the middle of nowhere, reminding Yuma that without them, he's nothing. He'll never survive on his own. And that was when Yuma began to apologize, reluctantly begging, pleading for his parents' forgiveness as tears began to stream down his face. Yuma did not want this to happen. He was truly sorry that there was no other choice but to destroy his parents. It was not easy watching the remains of his parents crackle and burn, their heads being consumed by fire, but they were now gone, and Chizumi did not really know what to say. It was all fun and evil at first, but seeing her brother suffering, gaining a power that he did not enjoy, maybe for the first time, Chizumi felt different when seeing her brother, feeling the weight of his actions. Hamaoka was not surprised when he found the house emptied when returning with the hopes of having a few questions answered. Nothing left but emptied bottles and the remains of rancid liquid that were just poured down the sink. Even though it's obvious that the Aziri siblings are, if not responsible, heavily connected to the dissolving incidents, and forensics can confirm that they were in possession of the remains of an unknown number of victims who were liquefied, judging by the emptied bottles. However, it was still not enough to say that it was the Aziris who are the ones responsible for the dissolving incidents throughout Japan. Originally, there were a handful of witnesses who can testify that the Aziris are connected, especially an orphan, a grade school kid, whose parents were not only dissolved, but was abducted by a pair of siblings named Chizumi and Yuma. Unfortunately, not only have all the witnesses ended up mysteriously disappearing, but the orphan was found dead one morning. He was murdered. And even though Hamaoka and his editor-in-chief, Mr. Mori, immediately suspected Yuma, who was responsible for the witnesses disappearing and the boy being murdered, however, the Aziris do have an alibi, seeing how they were at a real estate office in a different city when the murder occurred, unable to find a house without having a guarantor. So finding the siblings is not going to be easy. They can be anywhere. Basically, the idea of running a story accusing a pair of siblings of being connected to something that is sending Japan into a state of fear was risky and reckless. However, It took some time, but Hamaoka was able to convince Mr. Mori that there is a solid connection between the dissolving incidents and the Aziri siblings, and if he's right, they may be sitting on the biggest story of all time. And Hamaoka was fully confident that he can get these two kids on an exclusive interview. And as of right now, there's only one person who can find Yuma and Chizumi: Keiko. You see, when her brain was damaged from the dissolving attack, somehow she gained a telepathic connection with Yuma. It's because of her Hamaoka was able to find the siblings at that secluded house. And showing his editor, Mr. Mori, how Keiko was able to point out the siblings' location when holding the girl's arm, watching her struggling to lift a finger at a location within the mountains, just on the outskirts of a city. Mr. Mori knew that pursuing this story would be controversial, and would either end in a complete disaster or become a story that will expose one of the most shocking crimes in the world. And that was when Mr. Mori made the toughest decision as editor-in-chief. For a young man who has proven himself as a terror, so many lives that have fallen because of his power, this is not what Yuma wanted, having to move from house to house, city to city, always looking over his shoulder, and now forced into sleeping in a tent while being hunted down by some reporter. But most of all, there was no greater pain than seeing what had become of his sister. Chizumi was never supposed to be part of this. Instead, she suffered the consequences of Yuma's power. The horror of watching his sister being warped into a sadistic monster with cannibalistic cravings. Enduring the moments when Yuma wanted to end her corrupted life. If Yuma Aziri could wish for anything, it's to see his sister live in a normal, happy life. But obviously, that's not going to happen. And Chizumi knows it. Yuma could see it in her eyes, behind the sadistic grin, that demonic face. He could see a girl who's suffering, hating the very thing she's become. Another night of sleep, lost for Yuma, hounded by the sounds of those who had fallen victim to his power. Men and women who will never forgive him because of his irresistible love for the devil. And it was also on that night when Yuma would face a greater horror when being visited by a familiar face. Him, that reporter from the other day. Yuma, staggered at the fact that this reporter was able to track him down again, now with the opportunity to explain himself. Hamaoka wanted nothing more but to talk. To hear what Yuma has to say about the dissolving incidents, the disappearing witnesses, that boy who was just murdered, and how they are all connected to Yuma and his sister Chizumi. The fact is, Japan wants answers, and the Aziri siblings are the only ones who can do that. So if they are truly innocent, or there's something more to this, it would be wise for Yuma to come forward and explain himself. And even though Hamaoka is fully aware that he's putting his own life at risk when seeing Yuma throwing himself into a fit of apologies, that's not going to stop anything. In fact, it will just make things much worse for Yuma. You see, whether Yuma agrees to talk or not, there's still going to be a story about the Aziri siblings and how they are the prime suspects to the dissolving incidents. Even if something happens to Hamaoka, it won't stop his editor-in-chief from running the story and use Keiko to find out where Yuma's hiding. Basically, if Yuma Aziri refuses to talk, public opinion will take life of its own. And because of the psychic connection between Yuma and Keiko, there will be no place in the world where Yuma and Chizumi can hide. The world is about to know Yuma Aziri, and there's nothing he can do about it, which is why he grabbed his sister and ran as far and fast as he can. As promised, a couple days later, Yuma and Chizumi Aziri made front page news. And even though Akimoto Daily News received some anticipated backlash for the story, it was on the next day when their story paid off, when the Aziri siblings would finally come from the shadows and agree to an exclusive interview with Mr. Mori and discuss their connection with the dissolving incidents. An event that will not only be held at a press conference, but live streamed throughout the entire country. Japan and its people are about to get their answers. So this is it. Just a couple more hours, and the country is going to know the truth about the dissolving incidents, and much more. And for Hamaoka, everything is going according to plan. Now all that's left is to thank the girl who did more than just help him. I don't think one can imagine the work that had went into all this. All thanks to the efforts of a boy who had chosen to offer his body and soul, a girl spawned from a devil and the surviving victim. The world and its people are about to enjoy a horror show. And not one person had ever thought of the siblings as mere components for something much, much greater. Except Keiko. She was the only one who came close on knowing the truth, especially when a foolish act would have her experiencing the power, having a taste of its warming bliss. That power is what gives Yuma intense pleasure when seeking forgiveness, and the more Yuma uses it, the more exhilarating it becomes, heavily addictive. It's not only a power, but a curse. As a result of using that power, people dissolve, entrapping the human souls as the flesh dissolve into a puddle. Souls, just ripe for the taking. Sure, Yuma may have been fully aware of the devastating results of his power when accidentally killing his own parents, but didn't expect that his sister was part of the bargain. Chizumi, who would experience her demonic traits when tasting the liquefied brains of her parents, developing an intense craving for human souls, warping the innocent child into a demonic monster that would embark on a campaign of forcing her brother into using that power after terrorizing neighbors and innocent bystanders on the streets, forcing the poor boy into giving in to temptation, experiencing that supernatural high at the cost of human lives. Of course, there were a couple times that the Aziri siblings had almost ruined everything, like Yuma nearly killing his sister, and Chizumi giving into her human feelings when falling in love with that boy. But thankfully, everything had worked out for Mr. Hamaoka. Everybody played their part beautifully, especially Keiko. Oh yes, Mr. Hamaoka will never forget Keiko. The truth is, Keiko didn't survive the attack. Her life was spared, because Mr. Hamaoka had plans for her, which is why he partially melted her brain, just giving her enough functionality to convince the editor-in-chief, Mr. Mori, of Keiko developing superpowers. An event that will never be forgotten. How everything worked out so beautifully, every pawn that played their role. A country that is now haunted by fear. Fear and ignorance will always be an advantage in the fall of man. The siblings being introduced by Mr. Mori, the pawns who are about to publicly confess their roles with the dissolving incidents. Hamaoka wanted Keiko to see the fear within Yuma, his inner struggle to resist that temptation. Walking center stage, standing before the country and its people. Watch him fighting it. Watch how weak the boy truly is before giving in to temptation. Which is why he interrupted Mr. Mori and began screaming forgiveness, throwing himself to his knees, his body shaking, and with all of his might, his body and soul, Yuma Aziri just wanted the world to know that he was truly sorry for everything that happened. Such a pitiful act. Quite the show. Not what Mr. Mori expected, nor the country. Didn't know what to make of Yuma screaming frantically for forgiveness. the horror within his eyes as he announced full responsibility for everything, screaming sorry over and over and over at the top of his lungs, and his sister cheered him on. Yuma Ziri is going for it. And watching everybody demanding an explanation from the boy, confused and fed up with him just screaming on his knees, Keiko should feel blessed. The only one within the crowd who is not going to experience the event with ignorance. Hamaoka can feel it. Yuma's excitement, the exhilaration running through his body, all that energy coming from Yuma and making its way to him. And even though Keiko knew that she was not going to survive, there was just enough strength within her that Keiko was able to push herself from that wheelchair as everybody around her began to dissolve, stumbling towards the stage, trying to reach Yuma, mustering enough fortitude to scream the words, "Stop," wasting her final moments on stopping the inevitable before melting into a puddle of flesh. And with Keiko's pleas interrupting Yuma, watching her body dissolve into a fleshy puddle, the horror of seeing his sister frantically consuming Keiko's remains, finally getting a chance to experience Keiko's sweet brain juice, ignoring Keiko's fading voice, begging the demonic child from consuming her soul. That was when Yuma would finally witness the full horror of his actions. The entire conference room was now covered with melted flesh. Floor, walls, and ceiling oozing with the rancid liquids. The air filled with voices of all those who suffer from his power, hounding Yuma with their vows of never forgiving him for taking away their bodies, promising that he and his sister will pay for what he done. And that was when both Yuma and the demonic child, Chizumi, would suddenly be engulfed by the liquefied remains of their victims. The horrible event of that day at the press conference was an event that spreaded throughout the world by media. As to what happened to all those who watched the event, the whereabouts of Yuma and Chizumi is something that's gonna have to be left for your imagination.
Lucifer, Parcepses.